A conversation the other day with Nate Gerber reminded me of a recurrent problem in enterprise architecture around fixed ideas of timescale, as though there's only one timescale that exists. Business often assumes that there's just, for example, the longest timescale we deal with is 2 years at most. And if you look at something like the classic EA frameworks like TOGAF, they're actually designed for that kind of process, that kind of approach. But the reality is that we have a huge range of timescales all interweaving with each other. So for example, some industries have specific timescales. Health, for example, is by definition life. In fact, quite often longer than life if we're looking at things like epidemiology. So we have to be thinking in terms of holding data on someone, health information, for 100 years or more. Whereas most of the devices, the little sort of Fitbit and so on, no one thinks about what's going to happen when those devices die, because there's no way of getting the information back out of there and putting it into somewhere more useful. Well, health is, 100 years sounds ridiculously long to many business people, but that's actually what we're dealing with. And yet when we look at something like civil engineering, those timescales can go back hundreds of years. I think I mentioned in a previous video that parts of the London sewerage system are actually Roman. They're 2,000 years old. These are practical issues that we need to consider if we're working in those domains. IT looks very short-term by comparison. We've also got some context-specific challenges. For example, in telecoms, we have very real challenges around the speed of light. When we're looking at information going out and back to a satellite, or for that matter, when we're dealing with the incredibly small distances involved in the internal workings of a computer chip. Admiral Grace Hopper, the inventor of COBOL, used to walk around with sticks that were about that long, little strings of wire, because that's the distance that light travels in a nanosecond. When you're dealing with timescales that small, these become very real issues. Another one, in terms of my own business, my own range, the shortest timescale I routinely deal with is probably sub-microsecond. But the longest timescale I've had to deal with as an actual business issue was 250,000 years. Because we were delabeling hazardous goods or looking at issues around labelling of hazardous goods. And in the case of nuclear waste, we're talking about that kind of timescale. Literally 10 times longer than recorded human history, when we have to put up a sign that says don't touch, and we genuinely mean don't touch. That when we're dealing with forever chemicals, in principle, according to the legislation, we have to label it forever. That's an interesting challenge. Fairly obviously we marked it as non-compliant, but non-compliant doesn't mean that it disappears. It means that we have to come back and look at it again and again and again until we can find a way to make it work. So these are real timescales that occur in real business environments. As I said, mine range from sub-microsecond to 250,000 years. Other people may well have longer in each direction. The other one which came up particularly in that conversation is the fractality of timescales. We tend to think of strategy, tactics, operations in a very fixed way. That strategy is sort of the big picture, there's a longer timescale, and tactics gets it smaller. And then operations is very much focused around the now. But a useful way of looking at that, in terms of scans certainly, and that's a useful way to frame it, is in terms of that strategy is kind of above the plan stage. Strategy is the big picture. Where does it fit in relation to the larger whole, dynamically changing over time? The plan phase is the before we do action. That's where tactics tends to sit. And operations is in the during phase. But notice that those can have multiple this pattern will stay the same across multiple timescales. So that someone else's strategy could be our operations. If we're doing strategy, it actually is our operations. If someone else's operations could well be our strategy. So notice how these all interweave with each other. The boundaries are very much ones that we choose. Also, note that there are two fixed points here. On one end, there's the enterprise, the vision, the anchor that we use, which should in principle always stay the same. At the other end, there's the transition from the now to the past. Once we go past that travelling now, we can't change it. We can learn from it, but we can't change the past itself. And finally, notice that we choose where those boundaries are. They're not fixed points. They're not fixed things that strategy exists only there, tactics only there, operations only there. The boundaries are where we choose them to be. This is something we see quite often in things like services. Where is the boundary of a service? The answer is where we choose it to be. So notice these boundaries, that we choose them, and therefore it's important to choose wisely.